Hello, everyone. Welcome to Avaya's Overcoming PTSD curriculum. I'm Andy Anderson. My partner, Ike Allen, and I are teachers, mentors, and the co-owners of Avaya University. Avaya is the creator of over 1,000 books, films, courses, teachings, and other supportive resources. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Our fellow teacher, Gill, is here to talk with us today about integrative tips and tools for promoting emotional regulation and healing. Gill is the founder and clinical director at the Attachment and Trauma Treatment Center for Healing. She's also a registered psychotherapist, a certified trauma specialist, a trainer, consultant supervisor for the National Institute for Trauma and Loss in Children, and former psychology professor with over 18 years of experience working with children, with youth and adults in various settings. And her diverse background has provided her a wealth of skills in the area of trauma and attachment, mental health, compassion, fatigue prevention, eating disorders, wellness, you name it. Lori is honored to have received an Award of Excellence in 2014 for her contributions to the trauma field and to have been named as an expert witness in the areas of trauma, attachment, and reconciliation therapy. Wow. Well, you have quite the list of accomplishments, Lori. Thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thanks for having me, Andy.
Absolutely, my pleasure. So why don't we just start off with a, I guess, maybe pseudo-simple question as what is trauma?
Yeah. So trauma, really, there is no one universal definition. It's more so the meaning that an individual assigns to it. But we know that there are all kinds of adverse life experiences that can happen to people that really supersede their day-to-day coping and functioning skills. So we work with various forms of interpersonal traumas, abuses, attachment dysregulation, neglect, but we also work with things like home invasions, deaths by suicide, death by murder, and sadly things like human trafficking and exploitation. So, but really, again, it comes back to what the meaning the individual assigns to the experiences and the impact that it has on them as a unique individual.
Got it. So like that's trauma and the many definitions of trauma. What is specifically PTSD?
So when we talk about PTSD, that's an official diagnosis, and we typically don't work through the diagnostic lens. We're working more so through a window of tolerance lens. So we're looking at affect regulation. And what we understand is about human beings is that when we experience adverse life experiences or extreme states of stress, it can drastically disrupt our ability to function. It can send us into a hyper-aroused state where we're kind of stuck on, where we have too much energy or excess energy. So I often liken this to being stuck on like too much anger, fear, panic, anxiety, even too much excitement. And our body just feels kind of revved up all of the time. Or it can cause us to become stuck on off, where we feel kind of shut down, also referred to as hypoarousal, lethargic, exhausted, like we have nothing left. Quite often what we see with trauma is that people really oscillate between the two. So that kind of normative window of optimal arousal becomes smaller and smaller with the more stress and trauma that we experience. Trauma causes the amygdala, which is our security guard part of the brain, to activate more readily. So the more we experience stress and trauma, the faster and more often we kind of activate, and the less capacity we have to deal with kind of day-to-day stuff without it impacting us in a big way.
Okay, got it. Thank you. So let's dive a little bit into attachment. I know that's a big part of what you do. So for those unfamiliar with that term, what is attachment?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's an area that's receiving a lot of growth and attention when we look at the neuroscience aspects of it. We know that we are born primed for connection, attachment, attunement, and attachment really refers to that inborn need that we as human beings have to have loving, attuned, consistently available caregivers present. We now know that infants can't self-regulate. They're entirely reliant on their parents and their caregivers to bring about this affect regulation state through a process of co-regulation. And that when they have those loving, attuned kind of caregivers present for them, this teaches them, how to, as they get older, self-regulate through that supportive process. Sadly, we work a lot with individuals who have not had those healthy attachment experiences in their early life. And I don't think it's ever because somebody doesn't want to do that, but just often that people don't know how, and that historically it wasn't known, I think, how critical this is to our actual brain growth and development. There's research that's come out. Alan Shore talks a lot about this around, how rapidly our brain grows and develops in the earliest years, and in particular in that first year of life, where he says 5/6 of that brain growth and development is driven by attachment. So really critical and important for building our nervous system and our later life stress regulatory systems that we access throughout the lifespan.
Got it. So like you kind of touched on this, but just to dive a little deeper. So for people who experienced trauma as children, adverse childhood experiences, how does that trauma impact their brain as a developing child, and as well as their nervous system? And then I guess also, like, how does that then impact their adult life?
Mm-hmm. So attachment, when we have secure, healthy attachment relationships, it's considered to be neuroprotective. So it like optimally helps our brain grow and develop as best as it possibly can. And the brain develops from the inside out and the bottom up. So each of our brain networks continue to grow and develop, even if we've had, trauma or stress occur that may have impacted or inhibited brain growth and development. Typically, the regions that seem to be affected are the areas that are growing and developing at the time. So where previously we thought, children were magically resilient, well, their brain is rapidly growing and developing. So we now know that the brain regions that are growing and developing at the time that trauma and stress are occurring can directly impact the growth and development of those specific brain regions. So it can impact our emotional regulation skills. It can impact the nervous system growth and development, self-referential function, the ability to feel my feelings. So there are so many things that actually have their foundations in our earliest years that when we look at later life function and we're wondering, why people can't feel their feelings or be in their body or, emotionally regulate or have healthy relationships with others, those early life templates are really so critical for giving us the neural templates for knowing how and what to do and how to interact or how to emotionally regulate.
Mm-hmm. So for people watching who I would imagine are watching because they may not have had that, right, secure attachment, that healthy relationship with a parent, or maybe not both, or other traumatic things may have happened to them. How do they heal? How do they get through this and just learn to be
Yeah.
able to work through this trauma?
Yeah, so one of the most exciting things is there's so much new knowledge that we have coming out of the neuroscience research. One of the things that I think is so hopeful is our attachment experiences do shape how we relate to others, absolutely. But the research is suggesting, and I think this is Dan Siegel's that I reviewed this from originally, is saying that it's not even so much our attachment experiences, but whether we've been able to form meaning of our attachment experiences. So when we can emotionally connect to those experiences in a safe, structured way and, reflect on them from that meaning-making part of our brain, left hemisphere part of the brain, then we can integrate that and start to look at what we need and want to have happen differently. So that's one piece, is that we can form meaning of our experiences that helps us shift kind of what we do with that. The other piece is working through things in a safe, structured way allows healing to happen. So we use an integrative trauma and attachment treatment model that is really helpful, and often attachment is what we're working with. So helping people to process through their traumatic or adverse experiences in a safe, structured way and form meaning. But also the research is showing us that resource installation is incredibly helpful as well. So although cognitively, if you say, is your grandmother sitting there in the room with you right now? I know she's not, right? But my brain doesn't differentiate between somebody physically being with me and them not being with me if I kind of invite that cognitive part to scoot, right? So if I visualize, for example, loving, attuned connection, and I'm just focusing on that experience of that at that more right hemisphere felt, emotional felt state, I can embody that, and the brain doesn't actually differentiate that. So there are some incredible resources that help us to install resources, tools, and even experiences that we needed or wanted to have happen that perhaps were not available to us. And that can be incredibly, incredibly healing.
So what's an example of that? Like if someone didn't get, let's say they have trauma because they were emotionally neglected or something like that, like how would one do that in order to like have that experience? Like what, or any other example you could give?
Yeah, so there are several actually. So I'm trained in attachment-focused EMDR, and we do incorporate that into our model as well. So that's Laurel Parnell's model. And she talks about resource installation. So it may be a nurturing caregiver figure, right? And it's looking at those qualities, characteristics, skills, attributes of a nurturing figure. Doesn't have to be somebody in their life. It can be somebody real, it can be somebody created, but then we would look at taking those qualities, characteristics, and attributes and really honing in on those, right? Trying to deepen the experience of that. I often use Rick Hanson's HEAL technique, where he says, we need to first have an experience, real or created. So if my experience is isolation or abandonment, I need to have an experience of connection. So we have this experience of connection, real or created. Maybe it's created using the qualities and characteristics of this nurturing figure. Then we want to enrich the experience. So I often invite people to enrich it by taking it in with all of their senses. So, what would it look like, sound like, smell like? Anytime we're tapping into that right hemisphere, we're enriching from an embodied perspective, the emotional felt sense of that experience. Then I might look at, like what would your body posturing be like? What would theirs be like? What would the facial gestures look like? So we're just trying to make it richer and richer. He then says we need to absorb that experience. So for us, because I'm trained in Laurel Parnell's resource installation model, we'll tap it in. So we'll just bilaterally stimulate the brain and tap in the connection, that embodied felt state, when it feels solid for that person. And then the linking, the L, is for repeated pairing. So that's the harder part. So that means every time all of those old kind of messages and neural networks and neural pathways light up that say, oh my gosh, nobody cares, or you're alone, or, I'm so lonely. And we have years and years, perhaps decades and decades of messaging reinforcing that. We want to go, okay, there is that, right? We're going to validate it. It's not about ignoring it. But it's about noticing, yes, there is that. There's the pain, there's the hurt, there's the isolation. But then we redirect the energy and attention to where we want to focus. So if healing and moving forward and forming new neural pathways is what we want to do, then we're redirecting instead to that experience of connection, right? And then going back through that process of enriching it, absorbing it, and that repeated pairing of it allows us to form new neural pathways.
Got it. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for sharing, some of those different modalities for people too. So, so what, you may have touched on this, but what is specifically your intensive trauma therapy?
Oh, so we have a bit of a different model of treatment that we use with clients. And what we found is that a lot of clients in their communities don't have access to trauma-specific treatment models like ours. So we've had quite a few people come from out of province or even out of country to do treatment with us. And when we do an intensive model, basically what we do is we structure it so that we're getting in there and doing that work in a relatively quick, safe, structured way. But we're also weaving in things like breath work and meditation and mindfulness. We have a yoga practitioner that comes in and does some sound healing and breath work and meditation in between the sessions. So we're just titrating it to make sure that people are able to get in there and clear out, the stuff that's taking up the most space, but at the same time, re-regulating their nervous system throughout. It just, I find, helps to enhance the treatment and accelerate it. So the model itself that we use, people are generally regulated when they do the trauma processing anyways, because it's quite healing. So even though we're getting in there and we're dealing with stuff that has tremendous charge, we're working through it. Whereas people, I find, with their trauma, when they're in that fear looping, they go back to like the peak period of fear or terror, and they seem to get stuck there. And that's when people will become hyper-aroused and flood, or hypo-aroused and they'll shut down and dissociate. Whereas when we're working with them, we're working through it in a safe, structured way, and we're moving them past that typical point of peak terror to disrupt that fear looping process, and then playing it through, but also looking at, what they needed and wanted to have happen, and resource installing that, reframing messages to the security guard part of their brain. So it's quite a layered process. And by the end of, a single session, people are generally quite regulated. But then it's about taking it a little deeper with the nervous system and really working to clear out any of that excess stress that's been held in the body, to help them shift through that in a fully embodied way.
Got it. Awesome. Thank you. So I'd love it if you dive a little deeper into emotional regulation. So I hear the terms, right, regulated, like you just mentioned a couple of times, frequently when talking about trauma, like just layman's terms, like what does emotional regulation mean?
Yeah, so that's a great question too. When we talk, and maybe what I will do is actually do a screen share here,
Yeah,
because
great.
there's a visual that might be a little bit more helpful. Just bear
Yes,
with
take
me
your
for a
time.
second. There we go. Okay, so this is based on several of the other leading experts in the areas of trauma, Pat Ogden's work, Dan Siegel's work, and ultimately what this is a diagram of the window of tolerance, can be readily found online. And what it's talking about here is the normative range. So this is that optimal arousal zone that I spoke about earlier. So again, we're meant to have these kind of loving, attuned connections in infancy that help develop our nervous system. And when we have those healthy connections, what happens is we have this optimal arousal zone. And there may be things that happen in life that, cause us stress and bring us close to the edges. But for the most part, we re-regulate, right? So when a baby cries out, they're crying out because they need something, but then that need is met, so they re-regulate. There may be times in life, even as adults, where, we have tremendous loss or sleep disruption, right? And we come close to these edges of being shut down. But what happens again is we do re-regulate, right? With trauma, like I said, this drastically brings us outside of that window of tolerance. So it disrupts our ability to emotionally regulate in the same way, because that window becomes smaller and smaller. And, when we're stuck on, like I said, we have too much. So it might be anxiety, panic, hyperactivity, but we don't know what to do with it. People don't know how to discharge it. When we've had those healthy attachment relationships, we learn over time quite often how to release, excess stress. Maybe it's through turning to somebody who's a loving, nurturing caregiver, and they support us through that. Maybe it's through exercise, right? We get these tools that we learn bring our body to a calmer state. A lot of the clients we work with, unfortunately, really don't know. They know they don't feel okay, but they don't know how to fix it. So what we see is people will gravitate towards drugs, alcohol, cutting, self-harming, high-risk behaviors, right, in attempt to feel better. So part of our work is understanding, when we're working with people, are they cutting because they have tremendous pain and they're cutting to numb, right? Or are they cutting because they feel emotionally dead inside and they need to see their blood to know that they're still alive? When people are using, if they're stuck on, they're typically gravitating towards a substance that's going to bring that arousal level down. But if they go too far down, they might use a stimulant to level it out. So ultimately what they're doing without even knowing it is trying to bring themselves back into that optimal arousal zone. So part of our work is helping clients understand and track their affect, understand, the things that they've been using to try to self-regulate, and then find actual true resources that shift that affective state without shame or blame or guilt coming after, or negative health consequences or emotional consequences.
Beautiful.
Does that make
Thank
sense?
you. Yeah, that's really helpful. I really appreciate you sharing the visual with everyone too, because that it certainly helps me to get that. It's always nice to see
Great.
that, in front of us. So like I know you mentioned in the beginning when I asked you what PTSD was, that something along the lines of you don't necessarily work in the diagnostic area. Is that correct? Like I can't.
Yeah.
Okay. So I was going to ask you, right, can our viewers who, let's say, have been diagnosed with PTSD live a life free of PTSD? And since I know you don't work in that, or free of trauma, by whatever means, like, do you see that in your work?
Absolutely. I see it all the time. And sorry, just to clarify, it's not that we don't work with diagnostics. It's just that I find there's so much in life, unfortunately, where our medical systems are learning more about trauma, which is great, but there's so much that is often misdiagnosed as something like borderline or bipolar, or when we trace back the history, though, what we see is trauma, and these are survival driven adaptations that make perfect sense when we look at the history, right? And really, of course, they're responding that way because that's how human beings adapt and respond to the circumstances and situations they've experienced. So yes, though, is the answer to your question. I see healing all the time. And people often ask how I do the work that I do. And that's probably one of the biggest things is we see in as little as 4 sessions, people reducing addictions, drug use, self-harming, suicide ideation, and lasting shifts. So, the ability, yes, to see clients go through these unfathomable things that no humans should ever have to experience. And it's amazing how, many of them still continue to put one foot in front of the other and persevere. But then to see the growth that is possible and the healing and the authenticity that can develop out of that when we can reduce the charge and they can start figuring out, who they are in absence of the trauma. It is such a beautiful and, just such an honor to bear witness to that.
Beautiful. Yeah. To figure out who they are in the absence of trauma. That's so beautiful. So you mentioned a little while ago about how some relationship problems tend to be a, I guess, consequence, I'm not sure what language to use, of trauma, of childhood trauma, of having traumatic events, right? A lot of people struggle in intimate relationships. Any suggestions there? Any tips, tools, insights that you could share there for people who might be struggling with that based on past trauma?
Yeah, well, and this is a lot of the stuff that we'd unpack through the therapeutic process. But one of my favorite resources that I think everyone should read, trauma history or not, is Dan Siegel's book, Parenting from the Inside Out. It is such an incredible read. And I really don't think you have to be a parent to read it. I think you have to be a person, because what it does is he breaks down the neuroscience of relationships and how those templates shape how we relate to others. And that's that meaning-making piece that I was talking about earlier. So right hemisphere really, at a simplistic level, is involved with sight, sound, smell, sensations of touch, emotional memory. Left hemisphere really loves to form meaning out of stuff, to put it in order and give sequence and logic. When there's no sequence and logic, such as in the case of trauma, because it just doesn't make sense, right? It's not sequential. It's overwhelming. Something like that can help us start to unpack our experiences so that we can form meaning and reflect. And also, when we have that higher order part of the brain online and involved in forming meaning, then we can look at, well, now I understand where this comes from. Is it still serving me, right? Is this still what I need or want to be doing? Or how would I like it to be different? And we can start to build other templates.
So it's interesting, right? Yeah, that meaning-making machine, because when you first started talking about it, I was thinking about all the, let's just call it quote unquote, negative meanings that a human mind can make out of obviously traumatic experiences. And it sounds like what you're saying is like, we can also make positive meaning out of, right, something that we learned from maybe a bad experience or something, or at least that's what keeps coming up for me, is just kind of like reframing something because it helped us, become, a more strong person, or I don't know. Could you share anything around that?
Yeah. Well, the meaning making is so critical. And for us, it often is looking at that peak period of threat activation again, whatever that may have been, but quite often the message is, I'm going to die, right? And whether it's, interpersonal violence or harm that's happening, or a car accident or a near drowning or whatever it is, quite often there is that perceived or actual threat of safety, right? So if that's the message that's looping and the amygdala is on high alert because it's scanning for threat and thinking that at any time you're going to die. I've worked with people in their 70s processing something that happened in their like when they were 4 or 5 years old. And, we look at what scared them most at the time. Well, I thought I was going to die. And I can't tell you how many people I've said, did you die? And it's like their eyes get big and there's this awareness and they're like, no. And for the first time in like 68 years, they're realizing that they didn't die. all those years ago, and that they're okay. So then the meaning making becomes, we do what's called creating a new message to your amygdala. So, I'll say, okay, so knowing what you know now, like what message do you need to send your amygdala, or that security guard part of your brain? If it's attachment focused, we may be changing the message. If it's loss focused, it may be different as well. So we really tailor that message to whatever that person needs to be focusing on. And again, it's not devaluing what did happen. We always want to validate that. But we have to be so mindful of the messages we're sending ourselves, because if I'm focusing on, I can't do this anymore, and that's all I'm telling myself 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, except maybe an hour in therapy, that's what's being reinforced over and over, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, the current events, Joe Dispenza just did a great talk on COVID, right? And I know that when we are focused on fear, threat, and this is cell biology research as well, I think Bruce Lipton's work, fear causes our cells to shut down and die off. Love, joy, gratitude causes our cells to grow and multiply. So, in these times that are uncertain and scary and overwhelming, we don't, again, want to devalue that. But if that's what we focus on and that's what we live in, and our brain, the amygdala, is going to that worst case scenario that, maybe I'm going to get this and I'm going to die, and that's what my brain is looping in, you're setting into place the neurochemistry, the physiology, that accompanies that, the emotions that accompany that. And although you may not actually get that, you can bring your body to a state where your immune system is suppressed and where you feel worse and where emotionally you feel worse. So if we instead intentionally redirect our attention to things that we're grateful for, right? Validating, yeah, this is scary, this is uncertain, but this is what I'm going to focus on, right? I'm going to be present in, things that I'm grateful for, or I'm going to be present in things that I enjoy. I'm going to be present in nature. Even if you're not comfortable going outside, taking nature in, we can shift that affective state and boost our immune system.
Thank you for touching on that. That's so important right now, as we all sit in this very interesting scenario in our society. So I appreciate you touching on that, because I know a lot of people are definitely experiencing a lot of fear and uncertainty. So here we are all in it together.
Yes, we are.
Yes. So I'd love it if you'd share briefly about I know you do integrative healing retreats. So what are these?
Yeah, so really what we have developed, because we've had so many people come from out of area to do treatment with us, myself and the yoga practitioner that I mentioned, Lisa Scandalari, have developed some integrative healing retreats. And really, these are just meant to be pamper retreats, an opportunity to get away, do some deep healing, engage in some neurofeedback, some biofeedback, some yoga, meditation, in a beautiful space. So we were sadly looking at hosting something in Italy later this year, and obviously that's not happening, and my heart goes out to everybody there and around the world that is struggling. But we will be planning something for 2021, and the idea would be to have it in a tranquil space where people can come and just have time for healing, time for reflection, time to do that deeper therapy work, but also time to just connect and do some of that inward reflection work as well.
Beautiful. Thank you. I appreciate you touching on that for people who, once this whole thing is over, are interested in a physical event next year when hopefully we're all, able to see each other in person again. So awesome. So Lori, I'd love it if you'd share. We also want to let everyone know there's a button below this video that links over to your site for some online programs that you have. So could you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, so we do offer individual therapy. So we do the intensives, but we also offer individual one-on-one therapy and are doing group-based programming as well. We've got some online adaptations that we're doing for both group and individual currently. But we also have a trauma and attachment certification program, which is what the bulk of my time is spent focused on. And I generally am traveling all over the place, training people in our model, so agencies, organizations, can learn to do trauma-specific treatment in a safe, structured, and relatively efficient manner. And we have a trauma and attachment certification program that people can sign up for to become trained in our model. So we do have an online training coming up. Well, we have 2 of them coming up now in July and as well as June. Mm-hmm. And would love to offer a discount to participants that are coming through your organization and hearing about us through this call. So.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And everyone, again, there's a button below that you can click on to head over to Lori's site and check that out. And I know that we have a lot of people in our Avaya audience that are professionals in the area of mental health, as well as therapists and all sorts of different professions in that world. So if you are that and interested, I highly recommend you check out Lori's work and explore that. So can
I just add to that?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, just we have 2 different streams actually. And the one stream is for practitioners, and that's really meant for anyone. So anyone who's looking to become trauma informed. And that would be our core 2-day training, which breaks down some of the neuroscience of trauma and attachment a little bit in greater detail, gives some skills and resources. And then the second day is really looking more at tools and tips that we can use to promote regulation across the lifespan. Then we have a clinical stream, which is more designed for people actually doing therapeutic work, and it builds on that and breaks down our model. It teaches them how to use our integrative trauma and attachment treatment model. And just like any certification, there's experiential components, practice components where they are the therapist, they are the client. So yeah, there are two different streams for that.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate you making us clear about that, because we also, have obviously a mixed audience of people who are not in that professional field, but would be interested in doing it as a practitioner. So I love that. Any last insights? Anything else that you want to talk about before we wrap up?
No, I think I'm just grateful to be here. I think it's wonderful that you're doing this. The more that I teach people about trauma and the more I interact with people, as human beings, trauma is part of what we experience in life. Some of us have resources and supports to help us navigate it. And so we come through things differently, and some of us don't. And that really does make a difference. And I really would love people to know that healing is possible regardless of your circumstances and background. And as human beings, we have tremendous, tremendous capacity to heal and grow and redefine ourselves. So it's I hope it's very hopeful.
Beautiful. Redefine ourselves. I love that. Thank you, Lori. I really appreciate you and your work and saying yes to doing this with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Andy. I look forward to seeing the series online and sharing it with others.
Absolutely. And everyone who's watching or listening right now, thank you so much. We wouldn't obviously be doing this without you, without our amazing audience tuning in and being willing to show up for yourself and love yourself and being willing to heal and go on this journey together. So thank you so much. And we'll see you again real soon. Take care.